Good afternoon. Nice to see you. It's a pleasant day to be discussing such a difficult topic. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gareth Porter to the AUB, to the IFI. Actually, I should start by saying that there's a great deal of promise in Gareth Porter because he was born in a town called Independence, which is a very important thing. He was born in Independence and discovered, because of the Vietnam War, that the things one generally reads in the media may not be all correct. And he ended up then writing a series of books about the Vietnam War, including Perils of Dominance, Imbalance of Power, and The Road to War in Vietnam. In 2006, Gareth Porter began to look carefully at the story of the Iran nuclear problem. And his reporting from around then, you were already with the Interpress Services, with IPS, already I think in 2006. The reports on and about the so-called Iran problem won Gareth the 2012 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. It's an award given by the Martha Gellhorn Trust. By the way, if you don't know who Martha Gellhorn is, I recommend you Google her and find out. Quite an interesting person. His new book is called Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Craze, with, of course, the iconic photograph of our dear friend, Mr. Netanyahu, with his little Bugs Bunny drawing, talking about the dangers of the final stage. Well, Gareth, welcome to AUB. 20 minutes or so, half an hour, and then we can have a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Vijay. It's really a pleasure to be here at AUB, and particularly to have a chance to talk with people clearly engaged in the same issues that I care about. And so I thank you very much for organizing this event and for giving me this opportunity. What I want to do is, I want to talk about two things, actually. One is the central themes that I develop in my book, Manufactured Crisis. And also, I've just come from Tehran. I was there for 6 days, had an opportunity to interview Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, Mohammad Javad Zarif, at length about the negotiations. And I've written a story that I'm now desperately trying to get out in a place where it'll actually be read by a large number of people. I've not succeeded in that yet. I'm actively working on it, but we have to see whether I think it's a long shot, frankly. But I'll explain to you what that story is. Perhaps after I lay out the basic ideas or episodes that I describe and analyze in the book. So to begin with, just to give you an idea of how this book came about, when I began covering the Iran nuclear issue in 2006, just to give you an idea of how pervasive and how effective the false narrative about this issue has been, I actually believed it. I mean, to the extent that I assumed that, yes, of course, Iran must be interested in having nuclear weapons in some way, without really getting into the details or grasping any specific narrative at that point. I did assume that behind the smoke must be some sort of fire. That was the way I would describe my understanding. In 2006, when I really wrote the first story on this issue. But what happened then over the next few years was a series of what the social scientist or a scientific theorist would call anomalies, things that just don't quite fit, in fact, that contradict the paradigm, the dominant understanding of the particular issue in question. And the most important of these anomalies, or potential anomalies, I guess I should say, was the indication that these documents, which were so central to the case that had been made by the Bush administration through the International Atomic Energy Agency, beginning particularly in 2008, that Iran had been, in fact, pursuing a covert nuclear weapons program from 2001 to 2003. These documents, which some people dubbed the laptop documents because they supposedly came from the purloined laptop computer of one of the Iranian scientists or engineers involved in this purported program, these documents may well have been delivered to the Western intelligence services by the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. The indication was that there was an interview given by a German Foreign Office official named Carsten Void to the Wall Street Journal in November 2004, in which he warned that the United States and Europe should not make their policy on the basis of this information that had been mentioned by Secretary of State Colin Powell in remarks to the press, which Powell said involved information that Iran was working very hard to mate its Shahab-3 intermediate-range missile with a nuclear weapon. So here's a German Foreign Office official saying United States and Europe should not base their policy on this information because, he said, it came from an Iranian dissident group. Now, that, of course, suggested, that it was the MEK, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, because they are, in fact, the preeminent dissident group in Iran, an armed terrorist organization that is well known to have patron-client relations first with Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, serving in effect as an arm of the Saddam regime against Iran, and then after the war, having ties, very close ties and cooperative relations with Israel. And in fact, there is a good deal of evidence coming from sources which are by no means anti-Israeli, that, some of them at least, that the MEK was laundering intelligence from the Israelis to make it look like it came from the MEK rather than from Israel, so that Israelis would not be implicated in the information when it became public, because it might raise additional questions about the motive behind the information. So this was the first indication, this bit of information which I found very intriguing but couldn't do anything with at the time, came out and sort of made me sort of peel my eyes, if you will, for additional information about that. And to make a long story short, on that aspect of that anomaly, in 2013, when I began working on my book, I was able to actually interview Carsten Void, who had retired from the German Foreign Office in 2010. And he is no ordinary civil servant. He was, in fact, the spokesperson for the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, in the German parliament in the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s, before the SPD, of course, won the election and took over the government. And when that happened, he then was named to a senior position in the German Foreign Office as coordinator of North American German relations. So he was a very important official and someone who was very close to the leadership of that government. So what I learned from Carsten Void in that interview that I did in March 2013 really nails down a central fact about what actually happened, where these documents came from. He told me that after this informal press conference by Colin Powell in November 2004, the senior officials of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, I think I'm pronouncing it roughly correctly, but anyway, the BND, the German intelligence service, Foreign Intelligence Service, contacted him and wanted to talk to him about something related to this information. They told him that the information that Colin Powell referred to was quite familiar to them because they had gotten these documents from a sometime source. And that source was a member of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq. And furthermore, they told him that they regarded the source as doubtful, meaning dubious. So, in other words, they were not happy that the Bush administration was using this information coming from documents that had been given to them by this terrorist organization, member of the terrorist organization, because they had doubts about whether it was reliable, the source was reliable, the information was reliable. And there's a background, of course, to this, and I'm sure many of you will remember this. There was another German source who played a major role in another American policy fiasco, and that was a source who had the code name Curveball. He was an Iraqi exile in Germany who told his story of mobile bioweapons labs in Saddam's Iraq. And those stories were then relayed by the BND to the CIA, and the CIA gave them to, of course, the leadership of the Bush administration, and they were then used by Colin Powell in his speech before the Security Council justifying the U.S. plan to invade Iraq. It was, in fact, the centerpiece, if there was one, of that Colin Powell presentation. So clearly, these senior officials of the BND were afraid that history was going to repeat itself, that the Bush administration was planning to essentially build another false intelligence dossier with regard to the alleged covert nuclear weapons program of Iran to justify the use of military force against Iran. Well, we now know, it's well documented, and I have documentation in the book based on one of the National Security Council officials who worked on the issue of the Persian Gulf region, that the neoconservatives did in fact plan to use military force against Iran to bring about regime change. This was part of this broader vision, if you will, of a redrawing of the political map of the Middle East by, first of all, invading and occupying Iraq, taking over a series of major military bases, and then using that military presence and the military potential that it represented to both threaten the regimes of the region remaining who were not already client regimes, or actually using force, if necessary, to bring about regime change. And that, of course, meant Syria. It meant Somalia, and it meant Iran. And Iran was, of course, to be the crowning achievement of this strategy, the neoconservative strategy of regime change in the Middle East. I think the assumption was that this would be the final stage of this, because you'd have to take down Syria first. That was always the assumption. But in any case, we do have very strong information that the neoconservatives did have that plan. But of course, they didn't succeed. And the single biggest reason was that the war in Iraq failed. I mean, the occupation of Iraq was a fiasco. They just had no concept of reality of what was going on in Iraq. And therefore, they met such strong resistance on the part of the Iraqi, particularly the Sunni community in Iraq, that they were bogged down so seriously that the idea of another war was simply out of the question. But then later on, of course, you had a change of leadership in the U.S. military and the Pentagon, which brought to the key positions in those institutions men who were adamantly opposed to any war against Iran. And I think particularly, of course, of Robert M. Gates, who became Secretary of Defense in late 2006, and almost at the same time, a little bit later, Admiral William Fox Fallon, who became the commander of CENTCOM, the Central Command, and therefore was responsible for this set of countries, particularly Iran. And I wrote a story, actually, in the spring of 2007, quoting a source who had spoken with Fallon just before he assumed that position, in which Fallon said, there will be no war against Iran on my watch, guaranteeing that he would block it. And that certainly is one of the prerogatives of the commander of CENTCOM. In other words, he could threaten to quit and make an issue of it, which would be a major deterrent to any thought of making war against Iran. So that's why this effort to create a false dossier about Iran failed to bring about the war that the neoconservatives had planned. And so that really is the central episode that I build the story around. I also go back in time to the early 1990s, when the US government first began to talk about Iran as a threat to proliferate weapons of mass destruction, and particularly, of course, nuclear weapons. And I show that the circumstances that surrounded that policy in 1991-92 were that the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the Pentagon and the CIA were desperate to find a threat that would replace the one that had justified the levels of appropriations and the levels of manpower and programs that they had been able to sustain for decades during the Cold War. And under those circumstances, they first of all saw that proliferation of weapons of mass destruction was the logical new threat to replace the Soviet Union. They could present it as having sort of global reach, global implications. It could affect the United States directly. And it was the closest thing that they could come up with to a sort of Soviet-like threat. And then, of course, once they decided that WMD proliferation would be the theme, Saddam Hussein's regime had been defeated in the first Gulf War. It was a shadow of its former self militarily, did not have the credibility to sort of be portrayed as the next, the coming threat, the threat of the future. And clearly Iran, therefore, became the poster country, if you will, for this new threat that would replace the Soviet threat as the justification for Cold War levels, or what could approach, as well as they could approach it, the Cold War levels of appropriations for the major institutions of the national security state. So I document that case, and then I show that when you go to the Clinton administration, you combine that motivation on the part of the national security state with a decision by Clinton himself to essentially present himself and later his administration as more pro-Israeli than the George H.W. Bush administration had been. So very clearly, Clinton decided to turn his Middle East policy over to the pro-Israeli crowd in Washington. And the best, the biggest indication of that is that his advisor during the campaign was Martin Indyk, who had no credentials actually as an expert on the Middle East. He was not an academic specialist. He had not traveled throughout the Middle East. He did not have knowledge of the Middle East. He had been a media advisor to Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir of Israel. That was his sole claim to fame. And so he was there, clearly to represent Israeli interests. And that was the point, implicitly, of his being named as the advisor. Now, then what happened after Clinton was elected was that he became the National Security Council specialist on the Middle East, which normally means that he would coordinate meetings of various agencies to discuss policy issues regarding Middle East countries. In this case, however, he actually formulated the policy. And very soon after that, excuse me, in 1993, he came up, he wrote a speech which he gave, which represented the administration's policy toward Iran and Iraq. And in that speech, he essentially said what we must do is punish Iran by having severe sanctions, economic sanctions against them, so that the policy toward Iran would be similar to the policy toward Iraq. And of course, that was a brilliant maneuver, which then essentially became the approach that the United States has taken ever since, with varying degrees of severity of the sanctions, and of course, with the Bush administration, in the additional and much more serious plan of the neoconservatives, which I have to say was not, and I think most of you are aware of this, but it bears repeating, this was not the policy of the Bush administration as a whole. I mean, there were plenty of people, including Colin Powell himself in the State Department, who were opposed to the neoconservative plan. But the neoconservatives were able to steer, obviously, the administration in the direction they wanted them on Iraq, and they had every reason to believe that they could do so on Iran, except for things going very much awry in the case of Iraq. So that's the background of this episode. And then very quickly, to bring it closer to the present, I also talk about what happened in the IAEA after 2007 when, Director General Mohammed al-Baradei was very skeptical about these documents, never accepted their authenticity, in fact, very clearly doubted their authenticity from the time that he received them from the Bush administration in 2005, and insisted that their authenticity had to be essentially confirmed before they could be used as evidence against Iran. Nevertheless, the Bush administration put such heavy pressure on the IAEA and in some fashion suborned or drew to the Bush administration policy the head of the Safeguards Department, Ali Heinonen, starting in mid-2005, so that they could succeed in pushing the line that they wanted the IAEA to take, which was these, never mind whether they're authentic or not, they're credible. So therefore, we will push ahead with insisting that Iran must provide an explanation for these documents. And that then became the line that was taken by the IAEA 2008, 2009. And then, of course, al-Baradei left and was replaced by the much more pliable Yukiya Amano, who had already pledged to the Americans that he would be in their camp on the way the IAEA handled the Iran file, in return for the Americans supporting his candidacy to be elected as the Director General by the Board of Governors. So the fix was on when Amano came in, and it was after Romano took over that the IAEA then went much further and used a new set of documents, which al-Baradei has said in his own memoirs, published in 2011, came directly from the Israelis. Israelis made no bones about the fact that they were providing these documents and intelligence reports to the IAEA, and therefore there was no effort to hide that fact, as they had in the earlier case where the documents, I make the case that the laptop documents clearly came from Israel and were in fact fabricated by the Israelis. I don't have time to get into the details of that, but I do provide at least the analysis of the documents themselves, showing that there were contradictions, there were anomalies that show that they could not have been authentic. So a whole new set of documents used by the IAEA for this November 2011 report, which then became a huge media extravaganza, story after story coming out, particularly around the alleged steel cylinder which was supposed to have been installed at Parchin military facility in Iran in 2000, which the storyline then became the Iranians are trying to hide this fact by cleaning up the site, and they won't let us visit. So that then became the primary media story about the Iranian nuclear program, the one that was given the most play. And I go into a lot of detail about why that narrative doesn't hold up at all. So that brings us then to the Obama administration's decision to accept negotiations with the Iranian government of Hassan Rouhani in 2013, and the new phase of negotiations that have just taken place, where they're now beginning to try to draft a comprehensive agreement. Now, I've just come from Tehran, as I said, and I was able to interview Mohammad Javad Zarif about the Iranian position in these negotiations, and this is the first time that I've talked about this, but I'll give you a synopsis very briefly of what he said. He revealed for the first time that the Iranian negotiating position is based on a plan that would assure against breakout, this fantastic idea that the Iranians are going to flip the switch at some point and start enriching uranium using their low-enriched uranium, start enriching it to weapons grade as fast as they can, to race for a bomb, in front of the eyes of the world, because they would have to obviously either kick out the inspectors or, just physically seize control and in effect ignore the IAEA and signal to the world that they are in fact going for a bomb. And then it would be years before they had even a single nuclear weapon that they could use. There's no question about that. U.S. intelligence doesn't claim anything different from that. So it's a rather cockeyed notion, this whole idea of breakout. But it has become the basis of the U.S. negotiating position, and the Iranians have now responded to that by saying, okay, we will give you a plan. We'll be willing to carry out a plan that will assure against having a stockpile of sufficient size, even low-enriched uranium, that we could, in fact, break out to a nuclear weapon. And the way they would do it is that each new batch of low-enriched uranium would go directly into a stream that would be not available for higher enrichment. And that stream would, first of all, involve the conversion to oxide powder, and then it would be converted into fuel rods or fuel assemblies, either for the Bushehr reactor or for their research reactor in Tehran, the Tehran research reactor. So, he didn't provide details. He said, I can't give you the details of this because it's still under negotiation, but what he did say, which was extremely important, is that this plan is based on the proposal that was made by Iran to the EU3, UK, France, and Germany, in March of 2005. That plan is pretty well known, and it is precisely as I have described this proposal. And I quote the UK permanent representative to the IAEA, Peter Jenkins, in my book, because I had done a story quoting him earlier, saying that those three delegations who met with the Iranians and heard this proposal made in March 2005 said, we were all very impressed by this proposal. It was clearly very serious, and they knew that it was really worth pursuing. But the fix was on. I mean, the Bush administration had let them know that they were not allowed to negotiate any such thing with the Iranians. The only acceptable position was zero enrichment, no centrifuges should be spinning. That was the Bush administration position. And even though the Germans in particular, and the French to a lesser extent, were willing to pursue this, the UK certainly would not have done it because they were too close to the Bush administration, too close to the Americans. So there was never any question about pursuing the negotiations with the Iranians. But this fact, I've written a story, I'm trying to get into the press, as I say, and I don't know if I'll succeed, but I think it's a major story that helps to put the failure of the most recent round to begin to negotiate the beginnings of a text for this comprehensive agreement in a perspective that you don't get from the news media. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you. So, questions?
Comments?
Comments? Not too many speeches, but please, Rami, of course.
Thank you, Gareth. The commitment from the Iranians to follow this negotiation procedure, was this based also on the offer, the grand bargain offer that they had made through the Swiss under Khatami? Or was there a significant change?
No, there was a significant change. That offer was much less specific. It was very general. It was simply an offer to negotiate some kind of agreement that would address, the concerns of the Americans, but no commitment specifically around the, the stockpile of low-enriched uranium. So in fact, I should have added one further very important detail, which gives further depth to this proposal. I mean, it makes it even more significant. He told me that he personally developed that proposal. When he was, of course, at that time, 2005, he was the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. And he further said that he developed it on the basis of consultations with a number of senior, prominent American nuclear physicists. He mentioned Wolfgang Panofsky, who was, of course, a legendary U.S. physicist, part of the Manhattan Project. He's died since then. I think it was 2007 he died. And he wouldn't name the others. He said it's for them to step forward if they wish to. And of course, when I get back, I'll see if I can get some of them to talk about this, because I think it's a very interesting story. He did say that some of them are still actively writing about the Iran nuclear issue. So that's a clue that if you're really interested, you could use, you could look up who in the scientific community is writing about this issue, and you can make some pretty good guesses about who he actually consulted. But clearly, this is a proposal that he really did intend. He believed that he could convince the Americans that their interests would be served by this. And I really think that he has been somewhat taken aback by the hard line that the Obama administration is taking on these negotiations.
Please.
What is the likelihood that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, that it would use it against Israel? I mean, the whole proposition to me seems ludicrous, because if they were to use a nuclear weapon against Israel, they'd kill lots of Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's a silly idea. I mean, and I think you'd have a hard time finding anyone in Israel with any authority who believes that. I mean, obviously, there are plenty of people who have been propagandized over the years, who believe that now in Israel, but I don't think anyone, certainly in the national security community, believes it. It's and in fact, the official position of the Israeli intelligence community is that it's an agreement with the U.S. intelligence community that no decision has been made by Iran to go for a nuclear weapon. And there are more than a few hints that they now agree that there's no real indication that Iran is lusting after nuclear weapons. That's the implicit background, I think, to the position that has been taken publicly in Israel, that yes, we agree that there has been no decision to do that. There are plenty of people, I'm tempted to say even a majority of the senior level of military leaders in Israel certainly don't believe that Iran intends to go for, that they're intending any time in the foreseeable future to go for nuclear weapons. Even Ehud Barak, I believe it was last year, said publicly that he's not convinced that the Iranians are, going for nuclear weapons now. And indeed, even before that, Barak said, he was not convinced that the Iranian interest in nuclear weapons was about Israel, because he said they have other problems in the region, and they live with other nuclear powers in the region, and that probably is even more important than the Israeli concern. So there are all kinds of reasons to doubt that is a serious belief.
I have two quick questions. First, from 1991 to present, what has AIPAC's position been in all this? Has it just been limited to political rhetoric and electoral support? And also, what do you make of the nuclear physicists in Iran that have been assassinated in the past?
Well, let me answer the second one. That's more easily answered. I think I can do it very quickly. I think it's virtually a certainty that it was Mossad's work. The only question being, did they do it themselves or did they farm it out to the Mujahideen Khalq? I think there's strong evidence that they did it themselves, that they would not have trusted the MEK to do that job. I think that this is a job that they would entrust to Kurdish Jews who they had very long relations with and had been well trained directly by Mossad. I think that's the indication. And with regard to the AIPAC position, would you just repeat the question?
What has their place been in all of this, especially between Israel and America from the beginning to now?
Okay. Well, it was AIPAC that immediately followed up Martin Indyk's initiative. In 1995, it was AIPAC that basically wrote the legislation, the first major economic sanctions against Iran. That was an AIPAC piece of legislation. They were the ones who ensured that it would pass overwhelmingly in Congress. They did it again in 2001 when the Bush administration was just getting organized. AIPAC was way ahead of them. They had already gone out and organized Congress to renew the sanctions against both Syria and Iran. So, they've controlled the issue. They've controlled the issue from the time of the Clinton administration, for sure. I think that's not just an analytical opinion. That's just a fact.
Please.
Hi, I am wondering what your opinion is on Iran's lack of implementation of additional protocol. As you know, this is one of the biggest issues in the current Joint Plan of Action negotiations. And what do you think it would take for the Iranians to actually agree to implement and ratify and implement the additional protocol for a end result of peace in the Middle East? And also, with the conversations you had in the past of LU conversion and staying in centrifuge rods, is the plan of sending it to Turkey or to an external country out of the question for the Iranian regime from the conversations that you had? Thank you.
Good questions, particularly the second one. Very important question. On the first part of it, the additional protocol is absolutely part of the proposal of the Iranians. There's no question that they will agree to carry out the additional protocol and beyond. I think there's no doubt that the P5+1 are demanding more than the additional protocol, well beyond the additional protocol in terms of intrusive inspections. And all of the signals that I've seen are that Iran doesn't have a problem with that. I mean, that, the deal essentially is, we'll assure you on breakout, we'll give you, and part of the assurance is intrusive inspections in return for letting Iran actually have a civil nuclear program. And, I haven't talked about that problem, but of course that is what the United States is now proposing, is that they cannot have a civil nuclear program in the sense that they can support it themselves. They must rely, not just now, but for the indefinite future, on foreign suppliers of fuel rods or fuel assemblies for the Bushehr reactor and for any future indigenous reactors. The problem with that, of course, is that historically Iran has tried to rely on foreign suppliers, and what happened in the 1980s, early to mid-1980s, was that they were supposed to get their fuel assemblies from the French, to get the enriched uranium that would go into fuel assemblies from the French, from something called Eurodif, which Iran had a 10% stake in. It was a French-based multinational consortium. And the French government, under US pressure, the Reagan administration at that point, said, no, you cannot cooperate with Iran's nuclear program. Basically depriving them of the possibility of, having a nuclear reactor, unless Iran decided to enrich uranium itself. And that's, of course, what they did. They then went to the black market because the United States was blocking any cooperation in countries that were close to the United States, including Germany and France and other Western countries. So they went to the black market to get the enrichment technology that they needed to have an independent capability to enrich uranium. So that was the first episode. Then there's another episode. More recently, after 2000, the Russians had a contract with Iran to supply the nuclear fuel for Bushehr. And lo and behold, after the contract was signed with Iran, I believe it was 2005, if I remember correctly, the Americans had a pretty strong hold on the Russian government. They were negotiating a deal on nuclear cooperation. They did the same thing with the Chinese, by the way, in the 1990s. And the condition, of course, was that the Russians had to put pressure on Iran to stop enrichment. And so after signing the agreement with Iran, the Russians started holding back on the supply of the enriched uranium, the fuel for Bushehr. Even after they had promised a specific date, then they said, oh, well, they gave excuses that there were financial problems. That wasn't the reason. It was clear, and everybody basically admits this, that the Russians were holding back to put pressure on Iran. So they know that they cannot rely politically on any suppliers who are in the mix here in this situation. And that's why the Iranians are insisting that they have to rely on themselves. Now, they don't have the ability to do it yet. And here we get to the second, the part of your question that has to do with the fuel rods, with whether they send these to another country. And I think the question is, when will it be necessary to do so? What is going to be the timing of this? And I interviewed Salehi, Dr. Salehi, Salehi, I guess it's pronounced, Salehi, the head of Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, and he said, we're not ready to do this yet. We won't be for some time. And so I think it depends on whether Iran, when it comes time, it's going to be 2021, if I remember correctly, when the contract with Russia will expire. And the Iranians have sent signals that at that point they intend to be self-reliant, and I think they expect by that time that they will have the ability to do that. So I think at that point, they want to be able to not send the send the enriched uranium out to be converted. But in the meantime, if this deal goes through, it may well be that they will agree as part of the deal, I think, to send this abroad. We didn't discuss that. I think that's part of the negotiation that he didn't want to get into. But I don't think it's improbable that that's the case.
Here, you suggested that according to your discussions, you think that the Iranians are willing to accept intrusive inspections that would go much beyond the additional protocol. And here I'm a bit, or if you could explain a bit more about that, because my reading of the November interim agreement, or according to my reading, it seemed to me that the Iranians were trying to really make sure that one would identify that at some point, what exactly they would have to do for them to be back at some point to the regular status as any other member of the IAEA and party to the additional protocol, etc. So I was reading this as an attempt to make sure that what happened to Iraq doesn't happen to them, and that they're not stuck in an intrusive monitoring process that never ends, because one can never be 100% sure. So I see here that may contradict this, if I understood you right, the statement that they may be fine with an intrusive or more intrusive inspection process.
No, I think you're absolutely right about their position in their negotiations with the IAEA. I think that's absolutely correct. That they are insisting that there must be an end to the process which the IAEA began way back in 2003, 2004, of essentially saying, we have the authority to continue to insist that Iran must explain every new accusation that's made against them and go into Iran and interview whoever we want, et cetera, et cetera. And you're right, the Iranians are saying, no, there must be an end point to that. They have said that for years now. And that is indeed, I think, a fundamental part of their negotiating position. Specifically, of course, it's in this instance, it applies to reaching an agreement with the IAEA, but I think you're right, you're correct to relate that to the broader settlement. I think it is a condition for the broader settlement that there must be an understanding that Iran will be restored to the normal situation of members of the IAEA. At the same time, clearly, as I said, they accept the additional protocol, and I think there will be ways in which they'll be willing to go beyond the additional protocol, but within the context of that agreement that says, it's different from the present IAEA insistence that they want to go to Parchin, even though, they are unable to essentially present any evidence. There's no evidence whatsoever that there's anything at Parchin that has to do with nuclear weapons work. All they have is the accusation from the Israelis. That's it. There's nothing else. There has never been a single iota of evidence presented to support that. And if I understand the Iranian position, what they're saying is that they would like to see some evidence as the basis for the request to go in. That doesn't mean that they'll, in the end, refuse to let them in. I think they probably will. They're also using that request to go into Parchin as a negotiating chip. because it's a very effective negotiating chip with the IAEA. You want to go to Parchin? Okay, you've got to make a deal with us. You can't just do it whenever you want. You have to make a deal with us that includes this assurance that there's going to be an endpoint. And up to now, IAEA has never been willing to do that. Yeah.
According to your information, has there been any attempt from the Iranian side to connect their fight and the need for intrusive monitoring, etc., with the project to build a zone free of mass destructions in the Middle East?
I have not seen or heard anything suggesting that they are making that a condition. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Not necessarily that formalized, but attempts at imagining a way to have in the mid to long run a monitoring system that would be more intrusive than the additional protocol, but that could be connected to regional to this project, which is regional in nature.
My sense is, and I've not asked the specific question or had any specific answer to this effect, but my sense is that the Iranian strategy is not to, the approach to Israeli nuclear weapons particularly is not to try to make anything relating to Israeli nuclear weapons a condition for anything that has to do with this deal, but rather to use the deal itself to give greater credibility and authority, if you will, to Iran's diplomatic role with regard to nuclear weapons. And, in fact, Iran has a unique position from which to address this issue of banning nuclear weapons, not just in the region, but worldwide. Because of Iran's unique status, I haven't talked about this, but it's another important theme in my book, that Iran is the one nation in the world that can credibly say we have religious, ethical scruples about nuclear weapons. I talk about the historical fact that during the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranians were subject to this awful chemical weapons offensive for 8 years by the Iraqis and never retaliated with chemical weapons. Now, that wasn't because they couldn't do it. The Iranian chemical sector was more highly developed than the Iraqi chemical sector during the 1980s. The only reason they didn't retaliate was that Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa saying this is illicit under Islam to have weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons. You cannot possess them or use them. And I took a trip to Qom, the holy city, and talked to a few ayatollahs there, two in particular, who talked about this fatwa that was issued by Khomeini during the Iran-Iraq War. In fact, I learned that there are both audio and video. There's audio and video evidence of Khomeini making that fatwa about no chemical weapons. The chemical weapons are illicit under Islam. And so I make the point in the book that this episode makes it absolutely credible that the Iranians, that Ali Khamenei's fatwa against nuclear weapons is in fact a genuine constraint on Iran's policy. And no other country in the world can claim that they have such constraints based on religion and the jurisprudence that comes from religious beliefs that prevent it from having nuclear weapons. That's a pretty important factor. It hasn't been given much credibility by Western government. It hasn't been given any credibility by Western governments or news media. But I think the Iranians believe that could be a basis for their playing a major role in the future on this nuclear weapons issue.
Please.
And the Indyk plan way back in the 80s to make small divided states from Pakistan all the way to Morocco so Israel can survive. Is this plan still viable or is it out of the question?
You're asking me about Kissinger's plan?
Yeah.
Okay.
To make divided states from Pakistan all the way to Morocco in favor of Israel.
Well, it's certainly on the table for Israel. I don't have any evidence that it is on the table with regard to the United States.
It was a plan in the past.
No, I know, but I don't think it is now an active or a major. It's not something that is playing into U.S. policy in the region at this point. At least in that sort of explicit, overt sense. Could it be? Could that thought be influencing policy? Yes, of course. To the extent that the United States, whichever party is in power, inevitably accommodates Israeli interests, then sure. I mean, it's always going to be in the background. It's always going to be a factor. I just don't think that there's an explicit policy at this point of trying to do that. I think, for example, in Iraq, in the case of Iraq, in the case of Syria, it's bound to have some degree of influence because of the Israeli factor.
Please.
Mr. Netanyahu photo was on the invitation for this event. My question is, what's the Israeli role or influence on this negotiation in the coming days? What's the Israeli role? My second question, what are you expecting from this negotiation? Thank you.
Yeah, well, the two questions are not unrelated, I don't think, actually. I don't think the two questions are unrelated.
No, not related. Of course not related.
Yes. So the role of the Israelis in these negotiations is that when the negotiations between the United States and Iran became serious last October, when it became clear that there were going to be serious negotiations, the Israelis insisted that the United States had to consult and, tried to get the United States to accept certain positions that the Israelis knew very well were deal breakers. For example, the one that I've written about myself is that they tried to get the Obama administration to accept that they would insist that as part of an agreement, the Iranians had to confess that they had a nuclear weapons program. They had to give a confession. They wanted straight out language in the agreement. They wanted it in the interim agreement that was reached in November. And interestingly, at one point, John Kerry, Secretary of State, did in fact use language suggesting that the Iranians needed to come clean. That's the language that pro-Israeli interests in the United States have always used. The Bush administration used that in 2008, actually December 2007, and into 2008, that Iran must come clean, meaning that it must admit that the laptop documents are in fact authentic and that they did all those things, that they did all that research that was shown in the laptop documents. And Kerry then returned to that language, Iran must come clean, in October of 2003. If I remember correctly, I may be a little bit confused on the timing, but at some point in 2013 is what I mean. 2013, he used that language, but in the end, the agreement itself, of course, steered clear of any such language and said there must be a resolution of the possible military dimensions issue. That's a very different sort of language, which allows a lot of flexibility. They can use it in different ways. They can, try to make the Iranians believe that, unless they do something to convince the IAEA there won't be any deal, which is what they've said, but they don't hold themselves to the Israeli language. So the Israelis failed on that point to get the Obama administration to accept what they wanted. And then, of course, the Israeli tried to use Congress. This is the much more well-known episode involving Israeli influence over the negotiations. They tried to use Congress to make it impossible for the administration to essentially negotiate, because the language of the legislation or the resolution that was on the table would have essentially made it impossible to reach an agreement. I mean, they were talking about Iran cannot have a ballistic missile that goes, they cannot test a ballistic missile that goes beyond 300 meters or something, 300 kilometers. 300 kilometers, that's absurd. I mean, and it was recognized as absurd at the time. But nevertheless, I mean, that was the tactic that was being used. So they have gone very far towards just trying to squash the possibility of any negotiations, and they failed in that. I mean, the Obama administration, to its credit, did stand up and really used, I think, the political clout that they have with the Democrats in the Senate to avoid that, and they said no to the Israelis on their most aggressive and deal-breaking proposals. Nevertheless, I would argue that Israeli influence on these talks is still very serious, and I think it's in two ways. One is that this whole idea of breakout, which the Obama administration is clearly basing its negotiating stance on, that idea essentially has been pushed by the people in the think tanks in Washington that are pro-Israeli. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies pushed that way back in 2006 or 2007. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy, people were talking about, they didn't use the term breakout, but they were using the concept as early as 2004. So this whole notion that there's a threat that Iran is going to do, what I described, which is a silly idea. I mean, and it's recognized as silly even by Gary Seymour, the guy who is now, he was Obama's advisor on weapons of mass destruction. He's now the head of something called United Against Nuclear Iran, which is, basically takes the Israeli position on most issues. But he says that this idea of breakout doesn't make any sense. It's an implausible scenario. So clearly, I regard that as essentially an Israeli intellectual, political concept, which has really sort of shaped the U.S. position. And I think that's the way in which they have had the most impact. And then secondly, the fact that the people in Congress who follow the Israeli line are clearly threatening that if the talks break down, they will go forward with more sanctions, and they will attack the Obama administration if they do agree to anything less than their present position. This is a political constraint on the Obama administration, which is very, very serious. And I think that to then link that to the other part of your question, I mean, I'm very pessimistic about these talks because, as Zarif said to me, the posturing he called it posturing, some of the statements that have been made by the U.S. delegates in the negotiations, and even more so outside the talks to the press, which talked about, that the Iranians will have to agree to a fraction of the number of centrifuges that they now have because of breakout, because otherwise the breakout will be only a couple of months or a few months. He calls that posturing, and he says, if they continue this, they will lose control of the public debate in the United States. And I think that's absolutely correct, that the Obama administration, unless it asserts an independent analysis of the situation, and part of the reason they don't is that they buy into this false narrative that I describe in my book. Unless they do that, they are going to be constrained in a way that will not allow them to reach an agreement with Iran. So that's why I'm very pessimistic.
The embargo, is hurting Iran? The Western embargo on Iran, is it hurting them or not too much?
Well, of course it's hurting them. But I would not want to bet that that's going to
change their policy.
That's not going to change their policy. That's not going to change their policy. I mean, I think it is true that, I mean, obviously, the Rouhani government has a different diplomatic posture from the previous government, but that's because the previous government was appealing, that the Ahmadinejad government was appealing to a constituency that wasn't, not only did not care about the sanctions, but thought they were good for Iran. They wanted to be, in a position where they were cut off from foreign sources of technology, and there was no possibility for an understanding with the Europeans and the Americans, because, well, for one thing, the Revolutionary Guards are making out like bandits in these situations, right? I mean, that's great for them. They're making, I mean, a lot of people are making a lot of money on these sanctions because of the distortions of the economy. Anytime you have a highly distorted economy, it creates opportunities for huge profits, and that's what's happening in Iran right now. And I must say, okay, my hotel was in the northern part of Tehran, which is the wealthier part of the city, but it's very hard to see any sign of impact of the sanctions if you walk around that part of Tehran. No, you don't feel them, and I mean that again. I'm not saying that they're not being hurt by it. I think they are, but the Iranians are terribly clever too about both evading the sanctions in various ways, and I'm sure they are. So the sanctions are not as effective as they were intended to be. We know that. But secondly, they're very clever about adjusting in many ways to the effects, to the impacts of the sanctions. So, and one of the ways, I mean, maybe a broader point here is that, as Arif said to me, this idea that's in the Western media that we are under terrific pressure to come up with results. If we don't come up with results that will stop the sanctions, we're in deep political trouble. They've got it all wrong. He said, for me, the most difficult time was when we seemed to be succeeding with the negotiations, that is the interim agreement. He said, the worst time was when I went back and I had to explain every detail of this to a public that is very skeptical about the West's intentions. And he said, if I turn down a deal, I will go home to a hero's welcome. And I'm sure that's true.
Yeah, that's the last question. Yeah.
Thanks. I was wondering, what role has and is Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries playing in all of this in terms of the negotiation, the politics, and the pressures on Iran?
Well, that one's harder for me to answer. I mean, I don't really have a good answer in terms of, knowing behind the scenes what exchanges have taken place between the United States and the Saudis, to what extent the Saudi influence makes any difference at all. My guess would be that it's much less important and perhaps not, has not really had any perceptible influence at all on the U.S. position, because the Saudi position would be very similar to the Israeli position in any case. So I don't know that there'd be any change, any difference that would be felt in the U.S. policy there. So, I mean, I think the idea here, is that there is certainly on this issue of Iran and on the negotiations, there's a tri-cornered set of talks or consultations, in which both the Saudis and the Israelis are going to be trying to, essentially sabotage the negotiations, and the Americans, primarily, overwhelmingly because of the Saudi influence, because of the Israeli influence, do accommodate to a significant degree that set of concerns, but still, in an unrealistic way, hope to reach a deal that would be favorable to their interests, and trying to have it both ways, essentially. So I guess I think that the Saudi influence on this is minor to non-existent.
What about Europe? Does Europe have any say?
Not too much. I don't think so. I mean, I think it's still the case that, of course, the Europeans now are, if anything, more responsive to Israeli interests than the Obama administration is. I mean, particularly the French. Germans, much less so, and the UK in between. But yeah, I mean, the Europeans, if anything, will exert influence in the opposite direction to not allow the Obama administration to go too far towards accommodating Iran. I would guess. I mean, on balance.
All right, we're going to try to get copies of this book to Antoine's at some point. I'll write to the publisher today. You won't get access to it today, but here it is.
Yes, please be patient.
I better hold it just like Netanyahu holds that thing. So you get this book.
It was in the UN.
Yes, that's the UN
Yes,
General Assembly.
exactly.
And of course, I mean, it's funny because this is the moment which, in some sense, should have been his crowning glory, and instead, he made a fool of himself. Yeah, I mean, it was regarded as a speech which held Israel up to ridicule in a way, because he made a joke, as viewed from people who would normally be sympathetic to his point of view. He sort of made a joke out of a serious issue.
Well, we'll get this to the bookstore. Gareth Porter, thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.